After building a form for an application that has a workflow requirement, one of your next steps for the application build process will be to configure the start event for the workflow. In many cases, you will associate the workflow's start event with a form you have already designed using the wizard provided by the workflow start event in the K2 Workflow Designer. This event configuration will launch the Start Workflow from a Form wizard, where you can select the options Help me configure it or Do it for me. Now, these two options will work in many cases. However, for manual integration with a form to start a workflow, you can also select the option called I will do it myself later. Doing this gives you the option to set up workflow start rules down in the form instead. Upon finishing the wizard at this point, you will have references to smart object data in the form, and you can move on to configure the rest of the workflow even if you haven't completely wired the form up to start the workflow. Two items of note that I'd like to mention: you will need to add at least one task step and assign a recipient to that task in your workflow. You will also need to deploy the workflow to the K2 environment before you can wire the workflow start rule up manually in the form later. It is okay if the workflow is not completely where you want it, as long as there are no errors preventing deployment. You can do this without connecting the form to the start step. I'll show you what I mean by this in a few moments. I have already set up a task step in this basic demonstration, so I'll quickly deploy it. And from here, let's switch over to the example form and edit the start workflow rule. Inside this form, let's select a rule that is set up for the submit buttons clicked event. As you can see, this rule already exists. However, we could also add a new rule to a different control to handle the workflow start capability depending on our needs. Notice we also have the option to add a form state manually and associate the start rule with this new state. Let's just keep the form stateless for now. Upon editing the selected rule, we can go over to the Action tab and locate the action called Start a Workflow from the Workflow Interaction category. This will add the action to the rule list under the button clicked event on the right. Click on the Select Workflow link to pop up the Select a Workflow window. From there, open the category containing the desired workflow and select the workflow from the list. Now, this is where configuring a task step in the workflow and deploying it to the K2 environment comes into play. If you don't perform those steps, the workflow will not appear in this list until you do. Let's open the Configure link option now. This window allows both input and output mappings to be defined. It's always a good idea to add contextual information to the folio field at least. You can also set the expected duration and priority fields as needed. These can be linked to controls provided to users on the form for a more dynamic approach, or you could manually enter a desired numeric value in a hard-coded fashion. On the Input Mappings window, we will also see the workflow name that is automatically populated based on the selection we just made prior to this configuration window. I'll drag some fields over to add context to the folio, duration, and priority inputs. In the Workflow Fields section, we can also map necessary smart objects from the category browser to the item references that the workflow will reference when the workflow starts. These item reference values from this smart object will be available for use down inside a running workflow instance. On the Output Mappings window, we have the option of mapping workflow contextual information with the purpose of using that information somewhere in the form, whether it be for display, for parameters, or within other rules. For example, we may want to show a section on the form with controls showing the workflow has started with a start date, and perhaps a link to the ViewFlow URL so that the user can open the ViewFlow report and visually see the state where the workflow is sitting. After having mapped our input and output mappings, we can click the Finish buttons to close the rule that will start the workflow when the Submit button has been clicked. This will save the form back to K2, and from there you can check the form in, and we can head back over to the Workflow Design canvas, click on the Workflow Start event, and you'll see that it has refreshed with an actual form starting the workflow.